Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's Dynamics 365 Tech Talk. Today's topic is Test Strategy for Finance and Operations Implementations. My name is Peggy, and I'll be your moderator today. We're broadcasting this web conference through Teams live events, and the audio can be heard through your device speakers. Today's web conference is being recorded on behalf of the Microsoft Corporation. By participating in this session using Microsoft Teams, your name, email address, phone number, and/or title may be viewable by other session participants. If you do not consent to being a part of a recorded session, please disconnect at this time. The recording will be available on the TechTalk's Community Dynamics page within 5 business days. If you have questions for the presenters or need support, please use the Q&A panel located on the right side of your screen. Our presenters will be responding to your questions throughout today's event. Thank you for your patience during these announcements. Now on to the presentation. Presenting for us today from Microsoft, we have Ajit Kotwal, Principal R&D Solution Architect, Adi Vijayashankar, Senior R&D Solution Architect, and Toby James, Senior R&D Solution Architect. Ajit, over to you.
Thank you, Peggy, and welcome to this Tech Talk on Test Strategy. I'll be presenting this with my colleagues, Toby and Adi. The objectives for this Tech Talk are threefold. One is to kind of go through the importance of testing, and then secondly, we're going to provide some recommended practices on how to define a good test strategy for a finance and operations implementation. And then between Adi and Toby, they're gonna help describe some recommended practices for some of the key tests and test types that we expect to see in a finance and operations implementation. This is not aligned to any specific implementation methodologies. We have taken some pains to make sure that this test strategy description can apply to most methodologies, regardless of how you're approaching the project delivery. We're also not going to go into in-depth onto any of the automated test tools because there are other tech talks and other materials that deal with that. And we're also not going to be looking at every single type of test that you could perform in an implementation, but we will go through some of the key ones that we see. So we'll talk about why we test, we will talk about how to put a test strategy together, and then we'll talk a little bit in detail about the specific test types like unit testing, user acceptance testing, etc. So why we test? That's a question that is not as easy as it may sound on the surface. Depending on who you ask on a project and what role they perform and what phase the project is in, you'll get different answers, and all of these are legitimate answers that you can hear about why do we test. And each of the different roles that perform testing, or each of the different phases in which we do testing, may have slightly different outcomes that we're expecting, slightly different reasons that we're expecting to do the test. But ultimately, all of this needs to roll into the objective of making sure that we're testing so that the business can operate safely and efficiently at go live. Everything else that we're doing in the meanwhile is essentially propping up this goal, that we're doing various different things to help ensure that at production time, the system allows the business to operate safely and efficiently. Now, test strategy is a very wide description of a set of processes that can happen. And what we thought would be useful is to divide the test strategy into four key components, and I will talk through each one of these components in more detail as we go through. So the 4 components we'll talk through are the project scope definition, which directly informs the test scope definition, the various test types and test phases that you may want to apply during a project, the process of actually managing the test preparation, the test execution, the test reporting, and then finally the planning for the testing. And I will go through each one of these in a little bit more detail, starting with the project scope definition and how it informs the test scope definition. Probably the key one and the most obvious one is being able to define the business processes that are in scope for the project, because that has a direct relationship to how you should be thinking about defining the test scope in the test strategy. If the project has a set of requirements, but they are not mapped within a to-be business process, it makes it a little harder to be clear about what the expectation of that test should be. What is the expectation of the requirements? So the recommendation is try and see if we can anchor the requirements within some kind of end-to-end to-be business processes. That will help ensure that the expected outcome is a little bit more clear, and therefore our testing is a little bit more tuned to what is expected by the customer. And very often this is relatively well defined in most strategies that we come across. But I think the business processes or the functional requirements are only one aspect of the project scope. And when we're defining a test strategy, we ought to be looking at all the different dimensions, all the different aspects of project scope, so that we can explicitly define in the test strategy how we're going to cover the various different areas. So for example, data. How are we going to make sure that we provide the right data, the right quality for testing integrations, migrations, reporting, and so on? Batch processes in many organizations, the batch processes become quite a key part of the operational processes within an organization. And having them explicitly defined at an early stage, making sure they're defined in the test strategy and the means by which we're going to test them, helps ensure that this does not become a last-minute thought just as we're about to go live, or worse still, in the operational phase. Geographical scope, again, is something that is significant enough if you have a distributed rollout across multiple geographies. You may need to think about the different languages, local market differences, local regulatory requirements, any local infrastructure requirements. Security, think beyond project roles. Sometimes you need to think of security beyond the definition of security within the application. You may need to think about the infrastructure. You may need to think about regulatory requirements around security. Again, be explicit in the test strategy what part of the project scope is going to get covered by the test strategy and how. Focus your attention a little bit on the complex part of the business requirements, and also any custom designs, any custom implementation you may do, because you want to make sure that you're addressing the key risk areas within the implementation, and not smearing all the test effort equally across everything that might be in scope. What it also helps to do is when you define the complex areas and the custom designs explicitly, you also involve the business in making sure they're involved in helping you understand what are the key business areas that they see as being particularly risky or particularly impactful, that you need to make sure in the test strategy we make special room to address them explicitly. Also think about the non-functional requirements in the test strategy. So things like performance testing, infrastructure testing, usability testing, maintainability, operability, disaster recovery, business continuity. There are multiple different non-functional requirements that should also be explicitly defined in the test strategy as to whether and how you're going to be addressing them. Usability is a really key one and becoming increasingly important in our world as the demographics change of the people that are using our systems, and their expectations on usability are increasing every day. So making sure that's explicitly covered, definition of what does usability mean for a given project, for a given customer, and then explicitly making sure that you're going to address that in the test strategy somewhere. Also look for some of the softer things that sometimes get missed in a test strategy, like the impact of process changes and the impact of regulatory requirements, or even requirements that are policy requirements from within the organization. Process change is important because where you see significant change in the business process between today and when the system goes live, you may want to explicitly call that out and say that ought to be validated in a particular way to make sure that the transition is happening well enough from a change readiness perspective as well. And then finally, look at the business goals. This is something that gets quite a bit of attention at the start of the project when all the business stakeholders are involved, the project charter is being written up. And it's important that you explicitly address that in the test strategy. Say, how am I going to validate that the business goals that were set for the project, the business success criteria that was set for the project, are validated throughout the project so that it doesn't become something you look at only at the go, no-go time or just before go live when stakeholders are being asked to give their approval for the go live. So translating those business goals into something that is a deliverable that matches up with the goal helps you make sure in the test strategy that you're adequately covering the expectations of the business. And when you look at this set of dimensions, these set of aspects across the project scope, it also helps you to make sure that your testing effort and the attention of the testing is proportional to the business risk and the business impact, so that you're making sure that across all of the different areas, you've got the right level of emphasis for where there is the highest impact and the highest business risk, because you can't test every single combination of every single possibility. So let's talk about test types and test phases. Test phase essentially is something that can be considered as a set of testing processes that are executed once you reach a significant milestone or a significant phase starts. So things like system integration testing, user acceptance testing generally tend to be test phases because they're executed at the end of some kind of milestone being reached. And a test type is not necessarily tied to a milestone and can be executed multiple times during a project and very often forms part of one or multiple test phases. And the reason for distinguishing between them is really to make sure that we pay the right level of attention to both of these types of tests. Quite often in a test strategy, you may see, attention being paid to the test phases. So there's a definition of user acceptance testing, there's a definition of system integration testing, but there may not be a very clear definition of what security testing is going to happen, or data testing, or performance testing. So it's important that we give the right level of attention in the test strategy also to other types of testing that you might do. Now, the examples that we've given here, this is not an exhaustive list of the test types. There are many others like, device testing, etc. And depending on the project, you will have other types of tests that you need to conduct as part of the delivery. The important thing is to make sure that we adequately represent all of them in the test strategy up front, that they're defined at an early phase, and that they are part of the overall test strategy. So for each of the test phases, at least each of the key test phases and the test types, the recommendation is to think about the definition and the test strategy of how you define them and what are the different properties you should be considering for each of the test phases. And probably the most significant one of that is the objective of the test, right? What is it that you're expecting to test here? Why are you conducting this test? What is going to be the outcome, and what will that outcome have validated? This is something that is very important that you put down in writing, because different people have different expectations of the same test that may be called integration testing or interface testing or end-to-end testing. So it's important you define what you mean by this test, exactly what the objectives are, exactly what coverage this test is going to be providing. The other thing you want to be looking at when you describe a given test phase is to consider what is going to be the source for the test cases and the expected criteria. So, for example, if you're doing a system integration testing, what is going to be your source material for defining the test case and the expected results? Is it going to be a set of interface design documents? Is it going to be a set of FDDs? Is it going to be the original requirements? what is it that's going to be the source for this definition of this test? And the reason it's important you define this is it because it gives everybody in the project an understanding of where you're sourcing the test for against what are you testing in this test phase. The other important criteria here is the entry and exit criteria for the test. Define explicitly what is required to trigger this test. This makes sure that the right level of readiness is done. It also helps to make sure that everybody understands what work is expected to be done before this test phase or this test type can be executed. And it allows you to define a gate that needs to be met before that test phase makes sense to start executing. Exit criteria similarly help you to define at what point you say this test phase is done adequately enough for me to come out of it and get on with the next phase of work, whatever that might be. Again, be explicit about what the exit criteria are. Otherwise, there's always a risk that you end up in a cycle within a test phase and very hard to get out of it, because different people have different expectations of what needs to be the result before it can be considered to be done. The other areas here I hope are sufficiently self-explanatory around what tools you should be using, what are the project roles and resources needed to prepare, perform and report on the testing. One of the ones I want to call out is who owns the test type at test phase. This is important because the ownership of that given test phase means that that role needs to make sure they understand the objectives, the way in which the test is going to be conducted, what are the expected results, what are the outcomes going to be based on. It's important that that ownership is very clear so that there is clear direction for that test phase and there's clear understanding of who is driving the entry and exit criteria. For each of the test cases, again, think of what needs to be done in order to manage that test case. Right? For the key test phases, things like user acceptance testing, system integration testing, this is normally you might see this defined in a test strategy. The encouragement here is think of all the different types of testing that you may be conducting and think of the test management that's required for all of them. You may not need to go into as much detail for the smaller test types, but you should be considering all of these criteria for all of the types of testing you're going to do. So for the test preparation, what exactly is the preparation? Who's going to do it? When does it need to get done by? And how is it going to actually be done? Define all the different test roles and responsibilities. So who owns the definition of the test cases? Who decides whether the test cases are adequately defined? Who defines whether or not the expected results are correct? Who defines what level of testing is going to be done? These kind of roles and responsibilities are important, even more so than the roles and responsibility of who writes a test case and who actually executes it. Look at who is responsible for the outcomes, both in terms of approval of what testing is going to get done and approval of the outcomes. When you think of test cases and test scripts, again, look at what is going to be the source. Where are you going to get the data to be able to conduct the test? What kind of data is going to be used in the testing? Is it going to be data that's been migrated? Is it going to be data that you're making up? Is it going to be data that's coming from another source? Where are the acceptance criteria coming from? And think about the reusability of the test case. So it's very important in testing, regardless of the methodology that you do, that you think of incremental testing so that you're testing as you go along in the project and you're essentially creating test assets as you go along. So you're not waiting till the end of some phase before you start writing test scripts, start getting the data together. You're incrementally building up the testing muscle, the testing assets, and you're expanding a given test case from the start all the way through to user acceptance testing and then regression testing. So for example, consider when you're defining a functional test case, how that could be used to expand and become a process test script, and how can that be expanded or put in place with other processes to become an end-to-end test? How can that be reused in user acceptance testing. How does that then also transition to become a regression test if appropriate? So those are the things that if you can define in a test strategy ahead of time, it allows people who may not be as familiar with testing in an ERP project to be able to understand how you're expecting them to do some of these activities so that you are making the most of the reusability of the effort that you put into a test case or a test script or even the test harness. For each of the key test types, define what you're expecting the life cycle to be. So what is going to be the defect detection process? How are they going to get, when a defect is raised, who triages it? What are going to be the criteria for that triage? What is a priority 1 defect as opposed to a priority 3 defect? How does it go into the fix cycle? Who is going to be fixing it? How does it get validated before it gets released back? When it gets released back, how does it get back into the test cycle? What is the code branch that's going to be used? How is that entire cycle of defect detection all the way to closure going to work? Define that explicitly in the test strategy. Now, for most of the testing types, you will find that this can be reusable. You can just define it once and just reference it. But there may be some kinds of testing where you do need to define something very explicitly different. Think of what test administration tools you're going to use. So in order to make sure that you've got the requirements mapped to the design and then to the test cases, or the requirements directly to the test cases, where is that going to sit? Is it going to be a spreadsheet, or are you going to use some kind of tool like DevOps or Jira or whatever other tool that you may be using for managing your testing assets? Define that in the test strategy and make sure that it's clear how that is expected to be used. For the test reporting, think of how the test reporting is actually going to work. And the recommended practice here is think of test reporting or the outcomes of testing in 2 different ways. Think of it first of all in terms of what is needed for the project itself. This can be quite detailed and quite technical. So this may be making reference to whatever test administration tool you're using. If it's DevOps, you may be making reference to the actual percentage of test cases, the DevOps test ID number, etc. What percentage of test cases have been executed, what have passed, what is remaining, how many people have executed, how many tests, etc. Things that you need as a project to be able to manage the testing and be able to inform other people in the project about where the testing status is from a test delivery perspective. But also think of how you're going to do test reporting to stakeholders, right? I've very often seen a steerco, a test report that says, we've conducted 60% of the testing thus far and 75% of the test cases have passed. But that's not a very actionable report. It may mean something to the project, but it may not mean much to the stakeholders. The question they want to know there is, well, what does that tell me about the quality of the product that we're testing? What does that tell me about the progress that we're making? Is that a good result? Is that a bad result? Think of the stakeholder definition in a different way. Think of it in terms of either what is the implication of this in terms of the number of processes that you can actually execute without error in production use, or think of it in terms of what is the implication on the quality of what we're looking at. So make the test report actionable, interpret the results, and give a flavor of what the test results actually mean. And it's good if you define that in the test strategy document itself, so that it's not a discussion you're having during the testing, or even worse, at the time when you want to report the test results itself. It also helps you to define it early on, because you can reuse it for whichever test that you're doing as you go through the life cycle. The test planning, which is the kind of 4th corner of the test strategy, is also important, right? Make sure that everything that you're going to be doing in the testing is defined as a test plan, and it fits within the overall project plan. Many projects I see actually create a separate document for the test plan per test phase, at least the key test phases, separate from the test strategy document. And that is actually good practice because it allows you to keep the test strategy document having less churn, and the test plan can be a little bit more flexible because you may be reflecting, changes to the people, changes to exactly when the test is going to start, the number of test cases, and so on. So it's a good idea if you have a relatively complex project to think of a separate test plan, at least for the key test phases like user acceptance testing. But do make sure that the test plan and the overall project plan reflect each other and that there is adequate time allocated in the project plan to execute the testing that you believe is necessary to actually be safe in terms of ensuring the original outcome we talked about, which is a safe and efficient execution of business processes in production. Very often what you see in a test plan is allocating a duration. So saying, well, system integration testing will allow a couple of weeks. That should be plenty. Those are the kinds of things that can trip you up when you come up to actually the execution of the testing. It's better to say, let me validate that with making sure I include some effort. I do a little bit of work to say, what is the level of effort required to execute system integration testing? How many tests am I going to have? What is going to be the work to prepare for it? What is going to be the work to execute it? How long does it take to set up the data? How long does it take to set up any integrations with third-party systems? How many resources will I have to execute it? What is a realistic time to set up, execute, report, rerun any of the tests that may have failed? And that gives you a better feel for whether or not the effort and the timing allowed is sufficient or not. So do a double check by forward planning based on the actual effort and the cycles. Don't rely purely on a duration. Again, look at the related tasks and dependencies. And here, the better you've defined the properties of the test phase by saying, what are the entry criteria? What are the exit criteria? Who owns this test? The easier this becomes, because you can then look across 4 different dimensions. You can look at system readiness, and that means I need to know that the system is ready functionally, the integrations are going to be ready, that the various parts of the functional delivery are going to be ready. Look at the data. So is the data going to be ready? What is the expectation of data readiness here? Look at environments. What environments are going to be needed to execute this test or this test phase? Are they going to be ready? Who's going to make them ready? What data set are they going to have? If I need to reset the test database to restart a next cycle because I've conducted some destructive testing, what is the time that's going to take to do that? Who's going to do that? There are various things that need to happen on a test execution, and it's always useful to explicitly define those things in a test strategy that you can say, when it comes to the actual test plan, I can put in the specifics within the test plan, but I've defined the skeleton of what the related tasks and dependencies are. Don't forget the people element and the process element. You have to train people sometimes in order to conduct the testing. You also have to make sure that the test process itself is well understood by people, because very often you may have people on a project that have never done an ERP implementation before, or may not have done testing before. They need to know how to conduct testing. Right? Again, if you've defined in the test management phase the life cycle of a defect of the code, it helps you in the planning, because you can then look at that and say, what is the life cycle of a bug? What happens to the code? When it gets triaged, when it gets fixed, how does it come back into the test cycle? Does it come back into the test cycle as a hot fix? Does it come in on a defined timetable? Who's going to be validating it? What is the level of validation that is required? Do I need to rerun the entire test cycle, or am I just going to rerun a portion of it? All of that needs to be defined so that you know in the test planning how much time you need to allocate, who are the resources required for that. Also consider what are going to be the outcomes from the testing, right? Who is going to be looking at the outcomes? and what is going to be the result from the testing. There are many anti-patterns we could go through, but I'm going to just pick a couple of the ones that are probably the most impactful. One is when you see a test strategy and it's been defined in the methodology, it's very generic and it's not been tailored to the specific needs of this project and the specific project solution blueprint. And what happens is that it looks good in theory, but in practice does not get executed in the way that the test strategy is written. So look to make sure that the test strategy is made specific for the project that you're about to be executing. And the second one I want to pick out is to make sure that you have the right level of entry and exit criteria defined so that you don't have testing phases starting prematurely when really the project is not ready to start, and you end up wasting a lot of time because you can't execute the test to the right level of quality, and you fail to exit in a timely way, and you end up rerunning that test phase again and again. So this really is a summary slide which essentially deals with everything we've talked about thus far. And I want to re-emphasize the fact that testing is not really an event. You want to be thinking of testing as something you build up incrementally, that you define your test strategy early in the initiate phase, you define your functional and non-functional requirements in the initiate phase, and as you go through the implementation phase, you're actually building up your tests so that you are ready for user acceptance testing all the way through, and you're actually ready to create a regression test suite to be used as part of the deployment and also as part of the operational phase. I'm going to now hand you over to my colleague Adi, who's going to take you through the various test types in more detail. Adi, over to you now.
Yeah, thanks, Ajit. So here we're covering the different test support and different goals there. So there are a lot of different types of tests, right? There's not an exhaustive list of every type of test. It is a list of the different types of tests that's executed to achieve different goals throughout the life cycle of the implementation. So during each test type, we're looking to answer some specific questions, such as, does the code do what it is expected to do? Does the customization work according to the design? We could have made a code change or a configuration change. So did anything break from a system load perspective? Can I reliably integrate with the solution? Will the configuration allow me to execute the business process as expected? Or does the configured process meet the business requirements? Is a solution scaling as required? And then does my access reflect the role, aligning towards your security testing? Does a solution work with the data we are migrating from the legacy system, etc.? So when we're looking at these tests, it is important to understand what outcome and objectives are these tests supporting. There's a need to look at test as an activity that's executed throughout your project lifecycle and not to treat testing purely as a phase. So in the subsequent sections, we're going to explore the various types of testing that's performed in Dynamics 365 implementations. We look at these test types in the context of this order-to-cash scenario in Contoso Entertainment System. So we have Contoso Entertainment System, who is a distributor and installer of home electronic equipments. The sales orders for Contoso Entertainment System are created in Dynamics 365 CE, and they are dual written into FO. When the sales orders have to be confirmed, Contoso Entertainment System have some specific requirements, which requires an extension to be created in Dynamics 365 FO. Subsequently, during shipment creation, ASN requires to be sent to an external transportation system, and finally, the order is shipped and invoiced. So here is a visual representation of the order-to-cash scenario, which was explained previously. Some key callouts include capture of data migration requirements. That should happen in the early phase for sales order creation. That's very important. Therefore, ensuring testing is based on customers' data right from early stages of the project. We also included a scenario for shipment preparation to indicate that the individual shipment scenario occurs more frequently, let's say 95% of the time, when compared to a consolidated shipment, which occurs only during 5% of the time. Let's see later how this should impact the various testing types. Also, let's assume that Power Automate is used to send the ASN to the external transportation system. So basically, to summarize, in the order to cash scenario, we have an extension required during the sales order confirmation process and an interface via Power Automate between Dynamics 365 and an external transportation system. Now let's look at the various aspects of testing based on this order to cash scenario. So unit testing. What's the goal of unit testing? The goal of unit testing is it happens during the build phase, and it is to test the individual software component that has been developed in the dev environment. So in the previously mentioned order to cash scenario, unit testing is expected to be executed for the extensions built on the sales order confirmation to validate the sales orders of counter-source customers. The unit testing should also include testing of the interface built for integration between Dynamics 365 and external transportation system using Power Automate. The anti-patterns that we have seen during unit testing, here we have listed a few. The anti-pattern is testing is often noticed to be written for low value and redundant test cases. The other anti-pattern that we have seen is unit testing is often exploratory in nature. And we've often noticed that unit testing does not have considerations made for integration or performance and security and other non-functional requirements. Moving on to functional testing. The goal of functional testing, which happens during the build phase, is to test the individual component that has been developed or configured in the dev or test environment and validate that the development and configuration matches the acceptance criteria of the business requirement. So to always test with an assumption that all code is guilty until proven innocent. In the previously mentioned order to cash scenario, functional testing only includes the testing of the extension to sales order validation and integration with transportation system. It also includes all the configuration and setups related to customers and products used in the sales order that will be picked up in the warehouse based on the warehouse configuration. And finally, the account and payment related setup that allows for invoicing and payment of the sales order. So it should not only include the testing of the extension or integration only, it's the entire testing of that approach. So it's imperative to test with appropriate amount of customer data. The products and customers selected in the sales order could be actual customer data. Also, it's expected to not select the same set of data repeatedly. It should also consider various factors, including security, performance, and other non-functional requirements. What will be the number of lines in an order that will be confirmed? If this is done in a batch, what will be the volume of sales order lines that will be confirmed? Is there a good understanding of the business process to prioritize which sales order confirmation scenarios should be tested? If there are any inbound transactions, the functional testing should not only validate the successful creation of the record, but also process the transaction to completion. For example, the sales order created from CE into FO should not only be tested for the successful creation of the order, but this order should be subjected to the sales order confirmation extension, picking, packing, invoice, and eventually the payment. So the anti-patterns for functional testing. Some of the key anti-patterns as often noticed across implementations during functional testing include testing is only based on gaps and prepared without consulting with the business and SMEs, which often results in a very narrow scope for functional testing, and more importantly, does not cover the actual business scenarios and tend to be more hypothetical in nature. This results in the actual realistic testing occurring much later in the project lifecycle and therefore adding a lot of risk to the project. testing is executed against the same set of dummy data instead of data created by integration or migrated data, considering realistic business scenarios. This is another anti-pattern that we have seen in a lot of projects. And the other anti-pattern also is that test cases can't be reused or added to other testing to create extended processes or end-to-end test. It's important to prepare the test case with the end-to-end testing in mind right from the start, early phases of the project. This will greatly help in reusing the functional test in the subsequent process testing phase and eventually reused in the end-to-end test as well. So moving on to process test, the goal of process testing, which happens during the build phase, is to test the individual business process and build on the functional test in the test environment. Process test is expected to ensure that the business process is verified with all the possible business scenarios. So in the previously mentioned order to cash scenario, process testing should start with testing the sales order. This should consider both migrated orders and orders created in CE. These orders should be taken through the entire order to cash process, includes validating the extension, picking the order, prepare shipment, and validate primarily for the most frequently occurring scenario of individual shipment, and subsequently validate for the consolidated shipment as well. But the scenario should be focused on individual shipment primarily because that's the most frequently occurring scenario. Proceed with invoicing and payment of the order. Process testing of order to cash should also validate the financial posting from invoice and settlement of the payment, therefore validating the entire order to cash process, which could cut possibly across multiple modules, including sales, accounts receivable, and finance. This is true testing of the order to cash with the end-to-end testing in mind. So process testing anti-patterns. Some of the key anti-patterns that we have noticed is testing only focuses on the happy path and customization instead of the integrated business process and scenarios that include exceptions and edge cases. The sales order creation, confirmation, and picking process should also consider exceptions and the corresponding business processes. That should be where we should be focusing on for process testing. The anti-pattern that we have seen is testing is executed without the right environment, data, security, and configuration. Therefore, process testing should always be with customers' data, and this can significantly improve the testing outcome. Non-functional requirements, we often seen an anti-pattern here where these are not validated. And this is a common scenario across multiple implementation projects where the testing of non-functional requirements is initiated very late in the project, many times after SIT even, and when they could be tested well ahead in process testing phase. Moving on to the end-to-end testing, the goal of end-to-end testing, which should happen throughout the implementation phase in an iterative fashion, is to test the end-to-end business process in an integrated test environment, ensuring that all the complete business processes are verified with all possible business scenarios. In the previously mentioned scenario, this should be a natural progression from the process test where all the business processes such as order to cash, procure to pay, record to report are tested in an integrated environment where the interfaces are set up and the ASN will be sent to an external transportation test system and validated. In many projects, it has been noticed that this is the first phase where all the individual components are tested, and therefore end-to-end testing phase is it tend to be combined with process testing, and subsequently this impacts the SIT phase, and this has resulted in an anti-pattern where the SIT testing often extends to 2 to 3 times of the original estimate, which should be avoided in an end-to-end testing phase. End-to-end testing anti-patterns, some of the key anti-patterns as noticed across implementations are it's been identified that end-to-end testing is only focusing on integration with external systems or a specific work stream instead of a true end-to-end cross-functional process. Therefore, it's imperative for the end-to-end testing to be a true representation of the various end-to-end processes of the business, and the test case should be prepared accordingly. Other anti-pattern that we have noticed is that end-to-end testing is executed for the first time towards the end of the build phase. Expected process is for the end-to-end testing and preparation of test cases to be initiated right from the functional testing phase, and these test cases can be reused and built upon to prepare the end-to-end test. Anti-pattern that's noticed in many projects, it's not taking input from the business end users to ensure that the business scenarios are a true representation and include day in the life set of transactions. We will now have Toby discuss about the test types, talk about performance test, UAT, regression test, and their respective anti-patterns.
Thanks, Adi. So performance tests. So really the end goal of performance tests, and this is stating the obvious, is to ensure that the solution performs once it's in production. So we want to make sure that our critical business processes are appropriately optimized and that they can scale. We want to ensure the high risk areas, you know, those complex and custom designs that Ajit spoke about before. We want to make sure all of that is performing as it needs to be. And it's really important that we do all of this before we go live. Again, it sounds like I'm stating the obvious, but it's going to be, you're going to be in a much worse position if you find these things after going live. So why is this important? And I guess why would we even need to be concerned with performance in the first place? So I guess there are many aspects of a solution that determine how it performs, and many things that make each solution unique. You know, we have customizations, ISV solutions, how the solution is configured, you know, what modules, features are in use, how that data in the solution is distributed in that specific business context, how and when the various workloads are executed, and how the application might integrate with external systems. And then there are lots more factors that go into making a solution unique, and as such, having a performance risk there that you want to look at addressing through testing. So how should we approach performance testing? Now, we as a fast track team, we've actually published a lot of content in this area, so I'm not going to go into a lot of detail, and I've got a slide coming up that shows the different resources we have in this that will also be available in the deck when we publish this. However, the simple answer really boils down to you should approach this not a hugely different to how we're approaching other testing, right? Yes, we will have very specific outcomes around performance that we're driving, but you should still look at performance testing as tests that you're executing continuously and throughout the implementation, from the lower level components right through to the end-to-end solution. So don't look at a performance test as a phase or a cycle that we want to do just before we go live. They need to be tests. It needs to be an activity that you're performing throughout the implementation. A couple of examples here. We've got where a component test where we want to validate the performance of invoice posting, and we also want to validate the performance of the integration with the transportation system. So these are isolation type tests. The other tests we have here is where we're going to do a day in the life test with relative volumes across the key business processes, and this is not just prospect to cash. This would cover all the other processes, procure to pay, record to report, and anything else that's applicable for this solution. So some of the anti-patterns, and this list could be quite long, but I wanted to draw out sort of a couple of key areas, and probably starting with performance test objectives. It's really important that these are established early, and what we typically find is that there are certain key processes within the business that have these performance test objectives, but they're discovered late in a project. These might be around usability, such as a user response time for a business process that is critical. It might be a call center scenario, to batch jobs that might have significant volume there. So you can't expect the outcome of the test. So when you run the test to then drive the objectives really need to come first. I mentioned batch processes before. So you need, think about these. What is the impact if this batch process takes 2 hours versus 4 hours? Is there a downstream process that's dependent on this? Is there an SLA from the business perspective? Maybe there's certain statements that need to get to suppliers or customers in a certain time frame. These are the things you need to take into consideration when looking at performance test objectives. The other thing, and I mentioned it before, don't look at performance testing as something that's right at the end of the project. It needs to be an activity that's performed throughout. And this is some of the content we've published already. We're continuing to publish content in this space, so definitely stay tuned. And this, as I mentioned, this deck will be made available, and so you'll have access to all of these links. So user acceptance tests. Now, these are a great way to get feedback from the end users in the business. So, and this is not to say that user acceptance testing is the only mechanism for feedback. We all know that it's important to have a strong engagement with the business and the business users throughout an implementation. But these tests provide a very specific mechanism on a project for that final feedback and additional buy-in from the people who will be using the solution before it goes live. And the organizational change management program needs to be really plugged into this process. So don't look at UAT as an opportunity to pressure test the application and find as many bugs as possible. This is really not the point. That work should have been done. A bad UAT can backfire and be very damaging. So if there's been inadequate testing or preparation in the lead up to UAT and users finding lots of issues, it can be really frustrating and can undermine the confidence the business has in the solution. We've heard the stories. A bad UAT can, at best, it might delay the go live of the solution. At worst, it puts the project on hold, or the solution is shelved permanently. So it's really important that UAT is successful. Now, I'm not suggesting that UAT is going to be issue free. It's expected. You're going to find issues, and you want to surface these issues, but you should expect these issues to be more exploratory in nature, or some edge cases that maybe you hadn't anticipated. It shouldn't be sort of happy path tests. So a positive experience to UAT can really help build advocates of the solution throughout the business, and really helps that organizational change management initiative, which is always a challenge on these big transformation projects. So some of the anti-patterns I want to call out, probably 3 key areas. The first being business ownership. UAT is not a type of test or test phase that can be outsourced. It must be performed by people in the business who will use the production system. Now, if you find that there's business pushback, and we often hear that maybe I've still got, my team still need to do their day job, there's not enough time. This is a real signal of an organizational change management issue that needs to be addressed. Now, if you've had a strong business engagement throughout the implementation, that's less likely to occur. The other area we still tend to see is where, during user acceptance testing, where users are still testing with system administrator role. Now, not only is that a missed opportunity for users to test access control, but it's also impacting the user experience. So security roles don't only control access, but they also control what users see, such as menu items, buttons. So it's as much about user experience as access control. Training is the third area I want to call out here, and it's really important that users are adequately trained before starting this testing. So it's important that they have time to play and learn the new processes before that official UAT starts. Now, sometimes this forms part of a UAT preparation stage, but really without this, what you'll tend to see is that a UAT that's very slow to get going and very quickly falls behind schedule. The other thing you may see with this is where users are reporting lots of issues, but they're really as a result of their own learning rather than the quality of the solution itself. Looking at regression tests, so whenever we make a change to the solution, so be it configuration or code, we want to ensure that what was previously working still works. Now, regression testing is an activity that should be planned and executed throughout the implementation, not just something to think about post go live. A couple of examples here is where we want to test the key business processes when a new Microsoft update is made available. And another specific example here where we're testing the order and warehouse processes following a specific configuration change that might impact the picking process. So I guess one of the questions we often get asked is how do I determine what to test? How do I prioritize? And really the only way to answer this question is to look at it from the perspective of risk. You know, how do I manage the risk to my business by introducing this change to the solution? And regression tests are really a defensive test strategy. You're best looking at these from a risk perspective. You know, how can I ensure that my business can still operate safely and efficiently after the introduction of this change? Now, there's a few different ways to look at this. You could just test everything. Now, while that might provide comprehensive coverage, for the most part, it's typically not practical, and it tends to not provide any tangible value. It also can be expensive and time-consuming. Another option is to look at it from a business risk, business priority perspective. What are my key business processes? And you know, make sure that they are working when change is introduced. So this provides a sort of really clear focus, especially for automation, introducing automation. And while it may not ensure a completely regression-free solution, it's focusing on sort of key risks and reducing that risk to the business. Another angle to look at this from is to test based on the change that we know about. So this approach is going to allow you to target your testing, which can reduce the scope and effort of the overall testing. Now, while this sounds great in theory, this approach alone, I guess, tends to be quite short-sighted. You may neglect sort of downstream processes that are impacted by an upstream change. So, and the other thing too is it's really difficult to quantify the impact of a change. So, an example is a change to one line of code may be much more impactful than, say, changes to thousands of lines of code. So, how do you quantify that? That risk is quite hard. So really the recommended approach, the way you should look at this is by taking a balanced approach to your regression testing. Automation, I've seen a lot of questions come up around automation, and definitely this is something we will look at providing additional guidance around. But really for this talk, you know, automation is something you want to prioritize. As we've seen, you know, change cannot be avoided, and regression testing is going to be an ongoing activity that you'll be doing. So it's really important that the process is efficient and that your tests can be executed rapidly. How do you go about this? We've got tools such as the Regression Suite automation tool, Data Task automation, and there are other tools to build out your regression test suite. An approach is to begin with key business processes and build the automation out over time. And you can use your manual test suite as a bit of a backlog to identify and prioritize the test candidates for automation. And I won't go into these anti-patterns, but I've mentioned most of them. So just wrapping up, you know, there's lots of different test types. Again, I won't go in these. The slide deck will be available. This is also not an extensive list, but this is just highlighting that you do need to think about the different types of tests that you need to perform. So some key takeaways: define your test strategy early. It's really important to prioritize test scope to ensure you have the right coverage. Ajit took us through the 4 different areas to look at this from project scope, the different test types, test phases, the test planning and test management. Testing should be an activity that occurs continuously, early and throughout the life cycle of the solution. So not just in phases at sort of the end of a project. Test real scenarios and look at ways to prioritize the automation. Now, as far as the Q&A goes, we've really reached the end here. So what I wanted to do is just summarize here. We've covered the TechTalk, this TechTalk that covered the topic of test strategy quite broadly, and it's a big topic to squeeze into an hour. Hopefully we've given you enough to think about when putting together a test strategy, and we'd like to continue to provide very targeted guidance where you need it most. So in the chat window now, and I've seen a lot of you have been doing this throughout, and in the survey links that have been provided, tell us where you'd like us to go deeper. A couple of themes that I saw were around automation and agile. And if you're listening to the recording now, we are going to be providing an email alias on the Dynamics Tech Talk webpage for this Tech Talk to provide feedback as well. So think about projects that you've been a part of and where you've seen the biggest challenges in testing. Maybe it's a specific test type, automation, test management, whatever it is, please let us know through your feedback. And with that, I will hand it over to Peggy to close out the session.
Great. Thank you so much, Toby. So I have, as Toby mentioned, I have posted a link to a short survey in the Q&A panel, and we do truly appreciate your feedback on today's session and, as Toby mentioned, what you'd like to see in future sessions. The survey scores on a scale from 1 to 5, with 5 being the highest score possible. So again, we really, really appreciate your participation there. So that does conclude today's web conference. I hope everybody has a great day or evening wherever you are.